It's not often I talk about Tolkien-related media outside of the books, so this video is rather special in that regard. I'm going to be talking about a game, despite its issues, that is dear to my heart, and specifically a quest, or rather a series of quests, that I think capture some of the themes of Tolkien's work remarkably well. In this video, we're going to be talking about the town of Audaghaim from Lord of the Rings Online, a place that holds one of the most terrifying, most saddening quest lines in the entire game. Audaghaim is a town, or rather, more of a village in southern Mirkwood, released as part of the Siege of Mirkwood expansion back in 2009. Now, to be honest, southern Mirkwood wasn't great. It was a theme park looking zone that stepped away from the realistic world design the game usually presented. The stories were mostly forgettable, and the main story that was part of Volume 2 was pretty bad and nonsensical. On top of that, the actual expansion was seen as a step down from the previous Mines of Moria expansion, and it's perhaps due to the mediocrity of everything around it that Audaghaim kind of stands out. Now, I mentioned that Audaghaim is a village, but there's a twist. No living beings live there, but the ruined village is inhabited by the wraiths of men, woodmen who once lived in Greenwood the Great. In plenty of my videos, I've talked about why undead men are a pretty big deal. They're a rarity because it takes a lot to keep them around. Not even Sauron could do it with his necromancy. And this interests two in-game characters named Prestadir and Idrinfair. They're two Dunedain rangers who have joined the Meladrim, a non-canon invasion force of Mirkwood by the Galadrim, which is meant to provide cover for the footsteps of the Fellowship as they move down the Anduin. Idrinfair is baffled by the existence of such a place, thus he recruits the player to investigate what may have happened to Audaghaim, which is a complete mystery at this point. He directs the player to a small graveyard south of the village, and at the graveyard, the player uncovers 5 gravestones of note, and this is where the quest really gets interesting and quite spooky. The first stone belongs to Fritigern, aged 31, who died of natural causes on the 2nd of July 2461. The second stone belongs to Hakulf, aged 19, who died of illness on the 30th of June 2461. The third stone belongs to Beramud, aged 41, who took his own life on the 4th of July 2461. The fourth gravestone belongs to Vatagas, aged 27, who fell to his death on the 1st of July 2461. The fifth stone, however, is completely blank. This should immediately rouse suspicions that something wasn't quite right. Audaghaim was not a large place, so having 4 villagers, all of them quite young, die within 5 days of each other, all from completely unrelated causes, is odd to say the least. These deaths are also very close to a historic date in history, 2460, when the Necromancer, aka Sauron, returned to Dol Guldur and the Watchful Peace ended. And Audaghaim is not far from Dol Guldur. Idrinfair thinks this is odd as well. These deaths, even if truthfully recorded, do not explain why the village is haunted by wraiths. At this point, Prestadir decides to join the investigation. He sends the player into Audaghaim to defeat the Shades and search them for clues. Yes, I know searching ghosts is rather ridiculous, but hey, that's video games for you. Idrinfair wants the player to pursue a more peaceful method and search the village for a wraith that isn't hostile, in hopes that they will speak to the player. In the end, both methods come up with results. The player defeats several of the ghosts and discovers tokens that belong to the Necromancer. The Rangers already suspected this, but this confirmed that the villagers were in contact with the Necromancer. The peaceful method also raises some more questions. The player does manage to speak to a wraith who speaks as if they're still alive, that their village is perfectly fine, and that the forest is green and beautiful. This is objectively untrue. He also mentions that the villagers are set in their ways, and that change is good. When confronted about the graveyard, the ghost insists that every mortal dies and must be buried, and that there's nothing else to it. Then the player is told to piss off lest something bad happen to them. To both rangers, something about Audaghaim is now clear. Whatever happened to the village, the Necromancer was involved, but it still does not explain why the villagers are cursed. Both rangers send the player back into the village in order to find more clues, and once again, the player is successful. For Prestadir, the player discovers a book next to a ruined house. After 600 years, it's not in great condition, but Prestadir notes that many of the pages around the year 2461 have been purposely ripped out. Coincidentally, the same year all of those villagers died. For Idrinfair, the player discovers a shrine to the Necromancer, a connection that had already been made. However, the player also discovers some old bloodstains and a pile of weapons that were discarded out of sight. With all of this evidence, the Rangers come to a conclusion. The 4 villagers were murdered, the act was covered up, and now the cursed villagers were carrying on as if nothing bad had ever happened. Without any further leads, Prestidir bids the player return to the graveyard, to the 5th stone that was devoid of any carvings. There, a shade known as the Record Keeper of Audaghaim reveals itself to the player. The Record Keeper finally reveals the truth, that when the Necromancer returned, the villagers accepted him and worshipped him. The 4 individuals who were buried in the graveyard were the only 4 who resisted. They defaced the shrine to the Necromancer, and the other villagers brutally murdered them for it, and then covered it up. Unfortunately for them, with their dying breaths, the resistors cursed the residents of Audaghaim. But it gets darker. Alone of the villagers, the Record Keeper is the only one who feels remorse and repents. He writes a true account of what happens, revealing his own role in the events. Seeing an opportunity for progress, he was the one who led the villagers in accepting the Necromancer, and the one who led them in the murders. He also writes that he knows the enemy will soon find out about what he has written, and will then kill him and burn the truth. That's his last entry, and he is presumably found out and killed shortly afterwards. But before being killed, he buried copies of the pages that revealed the truth, pages that he now gives to the player. Unfortunately, this story does not really have a happy ending. Prestidir gives the player one final task: return to Audaghaim and confront the Shade they spoke to earlier, this time with the truth. The Shade reacts in anger. No, it is impossible. That story is no longer true. We destroyed that past and moved on with our lives. Why do you disturb our long peace with evils better left buried? That tale cannot be allowed to endure. You shall pay dearly for your meddling, outsider. The Shade then attacks the player but is defeated. But of course, defeat doesn't end the existence of the Shade, and by choosing to remain in denial and pretend that the past didn't happen, the race of Audaghaim have chosen to prolong their curse. Although the story of the 4 heroes who resisted has been uncovered, it doesn't change the fact that they were brutally murdered. At some point, Audaghaim was destroyed or abandoned, and its living became cursed to undeath. For me, this questline perfectly represents 2 aspects of Tolkien's storytelling: how easily men could be corrupted, and how Sauron operated. The Woodmen of Audaghaim were simple folk, true, but their simplicity was a tradition. When the Necromancer returned, bearing what was presumably inconsequential gifts, and the promise of power and progress, they were all too eager to accept him as their lord, and within a year of his return, they were willing to murder their own neighbours. Sure, perhaps they were in a difficult position, one rejects Sauron at their own peril, but to then collectively cover up and forget about whatever happened, that can't be excused. And, like I said, it shines a light on how Sauron operated. Sauron was not a mindless monster who trampled and destroyed everything in his path. He loved to be worshipped and obeyed, he took pleasure in corruption, and he subjugated his servants through many different means. It's something he had done in Numenor, something he had done in the east and south, and that's what makes Audaghaim so terrifying. It's not a powerful empire or nation that can offer military power. It was a quaint little village buried in the woods, changed forever by the return of a powerful figure that was beyond their understanding. Yet such was Sauron's evil that one can still imagine him laughing as he corrupted it beyond recognition. It gives us a window as to what life may have been like in areas subjugated by Sauron. You would worship him, and if you did not, your neighbours might kill you, perhaps out of fear of retribution, or perhaps they were devout followers who wouldn't tolerate blasphemy. It helps us understand how people like the Easterlings or the Haradrim could be so cruel or evil, because those that weren't didn't survive and their struggles were forgotten. Audaghaim itself might not be canon, but I'm sure a story completely identical to Audaghaim would have happened somewhere in Middle-earth. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I have many problems with Lord of the Rings Online, but when it comes to storytelling and lore building, it's usually pretty damn good. I think the writing especially flourishes when the story doesn't just cover what Tolkien has already told us, because it gives the writers a chance to flex their creative muscles. Anyways, cheers, farewell, and remember, don't murder your neighbours. Talk it out first, and then maybe murder them.